Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening for our program sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts, Implementing Post Peace Officers Standards and Training in Massachusetts. My name is Jen Miroff, and I'm one of the legislative specialists for the League. Thank you to all of you who advocated for passage of the police reform bill, which was signed into law in December 31st of 2020. We had the pleasure of hosting Rep. Miranda, Rep. El Ugardo, Rep. Holmes, and Rep. Gonzalez for police reform bill education events. Gonna admit our folks. Now we turn to its implementation. So many members have asked us how their own local police departments will implement the new law. We are very pleased to host Post Commissioner and Pittsfield Police Chief Michael Wynn this evening. First, some housekeeping issues. Please stay muted unless you're speaking to reduce background noise, and we will be recording for folks who cannot attend. We will give a brief review of the law, and then Chief Wynn will brief us for about 20 minutes on the work of the Post Commission, and he will answer your questions via the chat feature following his remarks. So now I'm just gonna share some slides to give us an overview of the law. To recap. Everyone see the slides? Great. So for an overview, so just to remind folks, an act relative to justice, equality, and accountability in law enforcement in the Commonwealth. So this is chapter 253 of the Acts of 2020. So it created a Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, and they would develop the use of force regulations, including a duty to intervene. The law also includes a review of the civil service exam. It creates 3 special commissions to study structural racism in correctional facilities, parole process, and probation services. It also limits the use of facial recognition technology. It prohibits the use of no-knock warrants where minors or seniors are present. School resource officers, SRO, will be hired at the discretion of the superintendent, allows public access to law enforcement misconduct records, and prohibits a decertified law enforcement officer from claiming immunity in civil liability. A number of commissions were also included in the law: structural racism in correctional facilities, structural racism in probation, structural racism in the parole process, a review of the civil service law, commission on facial recognition, commission on qualified immunity, which we have submitted written testimony, persons with disabilities, which is chaired by our own Needham representative, Denise Garlick, the status of Black men and boys, and the status of Latinx. So these commissions are meeting presently, and they have reporting deadlines, and I'll refer you to those resources at the end of these slides, but they are all available on malegislature.gov. So with regard to use of force prohibitions, physical force is prohibited unless de-escalation has been attempted. Deadly force also unless de-escalation has been attempted. Bans chokeholds and the training, but as we know, most police departments were not using these measures. Shooting into a moving vehicle unless necessary. Tear gas, chemical weapons, dogs, or rubber bullets are prohibited except when de-escalation tactics have been attempted and failed, and when necessary to prevent imminent harm or proportional response. It also requires the use of reporting. It requires reporting any use of these measures to the commission after the fact. And for school resource officers, they will undergo a certification process by June of next year. Establishes a model school resource officer memorandum of understanding task force. It's now under the discretion of the superintendent to request a school resource officer. Requires the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE, to collect and publish data related to mental and social emotional health support personnel versus the number of SROs and publish it to their website. And prohibits sharing immigration status and citizenship information. With regard to facial recognition, That's allowed after a written request to the RMB, FBI, or state police pursuant to a court order. And also report each facial recognition search to the Executive Office of Public Safety and Security, EOPS. They will have to publish an annual report. So for the post commission itself, there are 9 members. We're so happy to have Chief Wynn, who's one of the members. He's one of the post commissioners, appointed by Governor Baker and Attorney General Healy. There are 6 members outside law enforcement, a current police chief, retired Superior Court judge, and a social worker. So the post commission is responsible for the certification of officers. So there's a mandatory certification process now. So now we were the 47th state to enact one. There are only a handful of states left who don't have a certification process. So they're responsible for decertification or suspension of certification, and also reprimand in the event of certain misconduct. They've established rules governing the use of force by law enforcement officers, and they work with the Municipal Police Training Committee, MPTC, as the primary training body for law enforcement officers. So you can think of this as the civil enforcement agency for any violations of the police reform law. So they'll establish minimum officer certification. They'll receive complaints of officer misconduct from any source. They'll conduct adjudicatory proceedings, adopt, amend, or repeal regulations, and refer patterns of racial profiling or mishandling of complaints over to the Attorney General or federal, state, or local authorities. And just for some alphabet soup here, so the Municipal Police Training Committee, MPTC, the post commission works with them as the primary training body for law enforcement officers. And the MPTC is responsible for the development, delivery, and enforcement of training standards for municipal, MBTA, environmental, UMass, campus police officers, and deputy sheriffs. So the updates for the post commission, they have hired a new executive director, Enrique Zuniga. They're hiring legal counsel, chief technology officer, director of standards, and a director of certification. So this is like a whole new government agency being formed now. And the executive director sent a letter to all chiefs September 30th requesting data related to disciplinary records. They released use of force rules in October. There are 8,000 officers up for certification in July of 2022. And there were standards of police decertification need to be finalized by December 31st, and those will be made available via public hearings. So I provided a list of resources. Everyone who's attending, we can send these slides. There are some great materials out there. As mentioned, there's a post-commission website linked to the law. Senator Brownsberger, who is chair of the Senate Conference Committee, has tremendous resources on the law and also links to the other organizations. So I'm going to stop my share. Great. And now, if we can spotlight the chief, that would be amazing. So Chief Michael Wynn has served since 2007 as chief of the Pittsfield Police Department. Prior to his appointment as chief of police, Chief Wynn served successfully beginning in 1995 as a patrol officer, shift supervisor, shift commander, and administrative captain of the Pittsfield Police Department. He has also served as both a subject matter instructor and drill instructor at multiple police academies, including as an adjunct instructor for the Justice System Training and Research Institute at Roger Williams University since 2006, an instructor for the Municipal Police Training Committee in Randolph since 2001, and as a staff instructor for the Municipal Police Training Committee in Springfield from 2001 to 2007. From 2003 to 2004, Chief Wynn served as leadership fellow with the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration's Leadership Development Unit, where he earned certification as a DEA tactical instructor. He also serves since last year on the National Leadership Council of Fight Crime, Invest in Kids, a nonprofit that promotes bipartisan solutions to reduce crime and help children succeed, after serving as a local member for the previous 10 years. and has served as an adjunct professor at Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts since 2018. He earned a master's in criminal justice from Anna Maria College and his bachelor's degree from Williams College. Welcome, Chief Wynn.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you, at least virtually this evening, and for this opportunity to speak to you about the police reform legislation and the activities of the Post Commission. I think that Jennifer actually did a pretty good job of summarizing the history and the development. But if you'll indulge me for a couple minutes, I'd like to get a little bit into some of the weeds, because some of the dates that are included in the legislation have been a little difficult. And so I'd like people to understand what my fellow commissioners and I have been tasked with. And kind of it's the analogy that has been used to describe it to me, and I liken it to that, is we've been trying to build the plane in mid-flight, essentially. So as Jennifer said, the legislation was signed into law and enacted on December 31st, 2020. Fairly late in the evening. It was basically the next day, on the holiday, when we all became aware that it had been signed. And it wasn't until much later than that I actually was contacted about the possibility of being a post commissioner. I won't get into the details of that this evening. But we weren't appointed and sworn in officially until April 26th. So essentially, better part of 4 months, we weren't allowed to do any work at all. So we lost an entire, better than a quarter of the year. And so we got sworn in on April 26th and had a very quick introductory meeting in the State House, because prior to that day, none of the 9 of us had ever met each other. And we were informed as we were sitting in the library of 3 things. 1, we had no staff. 2, we had no budget. And 3, we had some very, very tight deadlines that were out in front of us. We were given the good news that our chair, retired Justice Margaret Hinkle, she had already done a little bit of legwork and had recruited some people that had intimate knowledge of Commonwealth government and had some experience in the State House, who were willing to assist us. And so we were able, at that initial meeting on April 26th, to at least secure the assistance of some outside counsel. And so following getting sworn in April, the next couple of weeks were really just a rush to actually get set up to do the work. Simple things like just getting all 9 of us Commonwealth email addresses and enabling us to be able to access Teams meetings so that we would be able to start to hold some of our public meetings. That took us into the beginning of May. And we very quickly realized that we had 2 firm deadlines in front of us that we didn't have a lot of, we didn't have any wiggle room with. We had to come up with a plan to go forward. And the first deadline was June 30th. We had to have been able to promulgate guidelines concerning developmentally appropriate de-escalation and disengagement tactics for minors. And so we jumped into that. Judge Hinkle appointed a 3-member working group to kind of dig into that and interview some subject matter experts from throughout the Commonwealth. I was fortunate enough to be appointed to that working group with Commissioner Dr. Hanya Bluestone, who is a forensic psychologist who specializes in adolescent issues, as well as has an interest in first responder issues, and my fellow commissioner, Commissioner Charlene Luma, who is a social worker. And so the 3 of us spent a good part of the spring working together, meeting with outside experts, doing some research, drafting some regulations. And I'm very proud to say that we were able to have a series of public meetings on those guidelines. And we were able to meet that deadline of June 30th and to promulgate those age appropriate de-escalation and disengagement guidelines. And so they went out after commission approval on June 30th. The next one that followed that up was a hard deadline of September 1st for regulations concerning use of force. And so the guidelines were difficult, but the post commission was entirely responsible for those guidelines. It was within our jurisdiction and within our authority to do the research that we wanted to do. And as long as we were complying with the open meeting law, we could pretty much vote to approve whatever we reached consensus and agreed on. The only people we really needed to pull into that were the outside experts we had identified. The regulations were different. To do the use of force regulations, first they had to be developed jointly with the Municipal Police Training Committee. So that was going to require at least twice as many meetings as we had spent on the guidelines, because we had to negotiate with the MPTC before we could take anything to the rest of the bodies and to the public hearings. And the other part of it was that they were going to be regulations. So ultimately, they were going to be subject to a full public hearing and promulgation through the Secretary of State's office, because this was not guidance, this was law. And so it got a lot more difficult and a lot more cumbersome, and the timeline to complete it was actually a little bit shorter. Rosemary, if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to keep going, and I'll get to that when we open it up for questions. So again, I was honored to be asked by Judge Hinkle to serve on that working group. And so myself, Commissioner Kesrosian, who is an attorney, and so Commissioner Marsha Kesrosian, who's a civil rights attorney, and Commissioner Kimberly West, who's also a civil rights attorney. The three of us got to work, and we started going through some background material, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, National Consensus Policy on Use of Force, the recommendations of the Police Executive Research Forum. And then the three of us began a series of negotiations with our counterparts from the Municipal Police Training Committee in order to come up with these draft regulations that we were then going to take back to the full Post Commission and the full Municipal Police Training Committee for a vote of approval. And then the joint regulations would be scheduled for a public hearing, and then we would take public commentary back, negotiate again, vote again, and get these things to the Secretary of State's office. So with about 100, so it normally takes about 120 days for the Secretary of State's office and the administrative offices to issue a set of regulations. And we had about 90 days. And so we got to work, and over the course of the summer, we had 5 scheduled public meetings. We met with our counterparts from the MPTC several times, and then we put together a draft to be promulgated in late July. It all come together in about 3.5 weeks, and then a public hearing was held on August 27th. We took the public commentary and written commentary that we received during that public hearing back, and the final publication went to the Secretary of State's or the Commonwealth Secretary's office on September 17th. And so the use of force regulations have been in effect since mid-September. Now, the interesting part about the use of force regulations, and it was briefly mentioned in my bio, but I've been a defensive tactics instructor and a use of force instructor for most of my police career. And the interesting thing in the Commonwealth is, prior to these regulations, we really stood on established federal case law and a handful of cases in the Commonwealth. There was no Commonwealth specific law regarding use of force. And while the overlying standard still remains federal case law, it was fairly unusual for that to be any law in the Commonwealth regarding police use of force. So although there's some minor changes to what was practical or what was allowable that was already being out there, I think as Jennifer said, outright prohibition on chokeholds, but we weren't using chokeholds in most of the Commonwealth anyway. So it essentially codified what we really had been doing for, again, most of my career. But it also established a set of regulations that the police chief, when developing policy, can now go reference directly instead of going and looking at federal case law. So that was the big one. We got those out, and then right around the time we were getting ready to get those out, we had our first staff hire. So Executive Director Zuniga was brought on board in mid-September. The good news for us was he was already working for the Commonwealth. He was over at the Gaming Commission. So to give him a little bit of time, he came over from the Gaming Commission to the Post Commission, and he started working with us on September 20th. So while we were doing all of that, there was another deadline that was out there that was in the legislation, but it didn't include any instructions on how to perform it, and there wasn't any staff. And that was the fact that as of July 1st, agency heads, police chiefs were supposed to be submitting newly received complaints or allegations of complaints to the Post Commission, but there wasn't anybody to send them to. And so in working with state IT and outside counsel, we were at least able to say, look, go set up an email account somewhere, just a generic email account, even if it's not being monitored right now, so we can tell the chiefs to get in compliance. We don't want to tell the chiefs, don't worry about it, we're not there yet. The law says you have to send them. We have to give them someplace to send them. And so we had that set up, and a couple months worth of submissions sitting in there when Executive Director Zuniga came on, and then he had to go look at this email box, and he's like, I'm going to need some help. So within a short period of time, the Executive Director Zuniga was able to bring on a administrative assistant, basically to kind of like take over the stuff, because prior to that, it was a member of our outside counsel that was basically helping us with our scheduling and our minutes. And then we just found out, and I don't even have the name with me, we just made the offer for our general counsel. And so we'll be bringing our staff attorney on in the next couple of weeks. The next major hire after that is the director of internet technology or information technology, the IT director, which may seem odd, except if you go back and you read into the details of the statute, one of the big things that the Post Commission is tasked with is establishing these publicly viewable databases, which means that somebody much smarter than I needs to be able to receive data that's being held in over 350 unique databases all through the Commonwealth and get them into one consolidated place where they can then be put in common viewable form and pushed out to something that the public can view. So the IT person is the next critical hire. And then immediately after that are online the directors of the two divisions within Post, the certification division and the standards division. And until all of those people are in place, we're really, essentially, we're just doing the work of establishing the rules because we can't do any of the actual investigative work or certification work. So our next big agenda between now and the end of the year is to figure out what certification is actually going to look like, what is going to be required and how that's going to be defined. And I don't want to get into the weeds, I'm about out of time, but one of the issues we have is that police reform legislation for the Commonwealth is a good thing. The Chiefs Association has been pushing on it for most of my tenure as a chief. But it didn't incorporate some things that a police chief or a police officer would like to have seen in there. And so one of the things that's in there that we're weighing is that the Post Commission is supposed to be tasked with either administering or accepting, either administering or endorsing a test and an interview for new hires. And it doesn't address local municipal control of the hiring process. And so how we're going to certify a test or delegate a test or accept a test or establish a test, that has to be figured out very, very quickly. And then by the same token, there's no way that the 9 post commissioners are going to interview every potential police candidate in the Commonwealth. It's just not doable. So we've got to figure out what that's going to look like and who that may be delegated to or shared with. And so that's kind of the Cliff's Notes version of, my life as a post commissioner for the last 10 months. Not quite 10, 6 months.
That is amazing. Thank you. Thank you for, it's fascinating. It's so many things we did not think about. So we really appreciate your time and your efforts and all your hard work on the post commission. So we're happy to take questions in the chat. I would like to kick things off and ask you the question, you know, when you were training chiefs in use of force, or maybe even, you know, what are your top 3 or 5 questions that you get from chiefs, and how do you handle them?
Regarding the changes,
Yes.
so I think the top couple of things I get from chiefs is, what is this going to mean for my officers? Is this, you know, what am I supposed to tell my officers? Is this going to make us less safe? And how are we supposed to arrest somebody who doesn't want to comply if we can't use force? That's the overarching thing. And what I tell the chiefs honestly is, you need to look back at what we've been training your officers to do for the last 20 years. Because although it wasn't taken into consideration during the negotiations for Massachusetts police reform legislation, the MPTC and the academies had been moving in this direction for a long time. It was actually the academies that recognized, hey, this chokehold thing is going to be problematic. Let's get it out of the curriculum. And so most of what you see in police reform legislation across the country, we had already been doing in the Commonwealth for a long time. When I addressed some other Commonwealth-wide groups, if I have to express one personal frustration, it's that the hard work the academies were doing prior to police reform wasn't recognized during the negotiation of police reform.
Thank you. Wow, that's excellent to hear. Excellent to hear. And you had worked with the training commission last week or 2 weeks ago, or MCOPA, about training in use of force, or was it something else?
So I've lost track of my dates. 2 weeks
Sorry.
ago, 2.5 weeks ago,
Okay.
I was in attendance as an attendee at the Mass Chiefs of Police Association's annual in-service training. And so I should set this up. I guess 7 years ago, maybe even go back farther. All police officers in the Commonwealth are required to attend 40 hours of mandatory in-service training every year. That's been that way for my entire career. And within that 40 hours, use of force is an annual requirement. Defensive tactics usually has an annual requirement. Firearms has an annual requirement. First aid and CPR has an annual requirement. And some element of legal updates has an annual requirement. All of that combined is usually somewhere above 24 hours. And then there's about 16 hours that's left for what they call the chief's local option, that we can put some other topics in there. The Municipal Police Training Committee, for most of my career, has done a great job of saying, hey, here's 40 hours of what we think you need to do based on what we've been seeing out there nationally and internationally. Here's the training topics we're going to require, and here's the training topics we're going to recommend. That's been that way for a long time. About 7 years ago, the Chiefs Association realized that in many cases, the first time a chief saw the in-service topics was when they were sitting within service with their officers. And if questions came up or if problems were detected, the chiefs were in a position where they couldn't respond. They didn't have access to it. So the Chiefs Association, in conjunction with the MPTC, made a decision 7 years ago that every year they're going to hold a mandatory in service for all serving chiefs who are able to attend, physically able to attend, health able to attend. Going to bring all the chiefs into one location. We're going to get the in-service topics for the next year before our people see them. If we detect any mistakes or we have any concerns, the MPTC has a chance to make some edits and changes. And then when we roll it out to our staff, if our staff has questions, we've seen it, we're informed. And so the chiefs all come together for the 3-day trainer, and they get all of the in-service topics. And for the last several years, 2020 pandemic aside, I've had the joy to have to get into a ballroom in front of 330 of my friends and colleagues and teach the use of force in DT blocks. We don't actually do the defensive tactics stuff there when they're in the ballroom in their suits. We send them back to their trainers for that. But we cover all of the material that they're going to see in the physical skill stuff. And so this year, because post was new, the decision was made that I would do the use of force, and it was combined this year. Use of force, de-escalation, and defensive tactics was one block. I, with my fellow presenter, who happens to be one of my officers, would do the use of force block for the chiefs. And so that was first block of instruction. And then, first full block of instruction. We had a briefing before that. And then just because it was convenient and I was there, the post commission chair and our executive director and our outside counsel came to the chiefs conference. And then we did a panel discussion for all the chiefs, basically the talking points I just read from. So all the chiefs were kind of on the same page.
Amazing. Amazing. And I know Chief Brooks of Norwood talks about that conference.
Chief Brooks
That's
is
awesome.
responsible for creating that conference.
Yeah, exactly. I love Chief Brooks. He's amazing. Great. Awesome. Thank you. So maybe we should turn it over and we can read the questions from the chat.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
I think I remember Rosemary's question.
Okay, great.
So that was the one about staff and support. So the good news is that the governor, and I don't have the figures, it's being handled by the executive director and the chair, but the governor recognized it was an impossible task. And so they did an outside appropriation. They got us a pool of money that we could draw against. Because as a commissioner, it is a compensated position. So at the bare minimum, they needed to cover our hours and our travel. But we also had some business expenses. And then, as I said, Judge Hinkle had made, between the time we got identified and the time we got appointed, Judge Hinkle made some calls and she made some moves, and she had pulled together a group of associates that she had worked with in the past, many of whom had experience in the state house. And she essentially gathered this small team and said, I need your help. And most of them were already doing legal work with the state house anyway. So they were able to leverage that. And so we had a law firm that was assisting us. We had a full-time chair, mostly full-time chair. And then we got some administrative support from, so like we had we had one public meeting scheduled for the one day that fell between the expiration of the governor's emergency order and the reissuance of the governor's emergency order. So we had to meet in public in Boston. And so the gaming commission gave us space and staff.
Nice. Awesome. And Susan is asking, how are police departments responding to this work? Which I think you addressed, but maybe if you want to go into some more detail.
I think in general, police, so let me just say, one of the things that came out during the negotiation of the legislation and the enactment of police reform, there's a lot of small police departments in this Commonwealth, a lot, right? I think, depending on how you count them, there's 350 some odd law enforcement agencies in the Commonwealth, and most of them have fewer than 5 people. So there's some departments out there that they just don't know how to respond to this. We found some departments that they hadn't been doing their in-service. We found some departments that they had 40-year veterans who were part-time chiefs and they had been to a part-time academy. Right? So some of those agencies, they're out of luck, right? They don't know what they're going to do. They don't know how to respond. But most of the police departments that we're all familiar with, that they have professional staff, they're looking at it and saying, okay, thanks for recognizing the work that we've been doing. We've got some concerns about some of the changes, but we understand. I had a fellow chief during the kind of 4 months at the beginning of the year say, if we had come into this and we had termed it police improvement instead of police reform, nobody would have an issue with this. Because most of the big things in here, certification, decertification, cops have been asking for years. Use of force regulations, cops have been asking for years. So there's some things in here that people are like, I'll give you an example. So when Jennifer was going through the slides, she talked specifically about the language around tear gas, chemical weapons, dogs. The language in the statute is rubber bullets. It wasn't clear on the slide, and I don't think a lot of people understand this. In the statute and in the regulations, that language only applies to large-scale civil disturbances, peaceful protests. It doesn't have to do with barricaded subjects. It doesn't have to do with, if we've got a hostage taking or something. It has to do with protected First Amendment gatherings, right? So when we can tell the police officer, look, this is the state police had a huge issue with the fact that canines were mentioned. And we're like, it's only canines at protests, right? It doesn't have anything to do with tracking. It doesn't have anything to do with lost persons. And it doesn't have anything to do with drug searches. So once we were able to kind of calm the panic, they calmed down.
Amazing. Thank you for clarifying that. That is tremendously helpful. And Rosemary had another comment, talking with police chief on Cape Cod. He's been doing interviews for new officers for years. So chiefs certainly can bring a lot of experience for interviews when you were talking about hiring.
In my conversation, particularly around that issue with executive directors in EGA and with our outside counsel, so we're a civil service department. That's a whole nother set of issues. I am not the appointing authority for police officers in the city. My mayor is. I'm on my third mayor. I can guarantee none of my mayors would have given up hiring control of a police officer to some faceless stranger from Boston. So we're going to have to negotiate that, because having somebody who's never set foot in the city of Pittsfield interview my officers, it's kind of smells to me.
That does seem strange. There was another question about investigatory arm of the post commission. Could you speak a little bit about that?
I can tell you that I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
So the police standards division will be the investigatory arm after the IT director. Certification and standards, those are the two next key staff to be hired. We have to hire investigators. It's kind of unclear how that's going to work. The language appears to indicate they can't have previous law enforcement experience. We don't know where you find investigators, trained investigators who don't have some law enforcement experience, but we haven't even started discussing what that process might look like yet. So we will have investigators. They will have authority to do misconduct investigations, but that's very much a work in progress.
Great, thanks. And Judith is asking about school resource officers.
Okay. So school resource officers have been a hot topic of conversation, not only throughout the Commonwealth, here in my hometown. What I can tell you is that the Attorney General, even before 2020 police reform, the Attorney General had already taken a leadership role in this, and she and her office had already written, following juvenile justice reform in 2017, a model memorandum of understanding between municipalities and school districts for school resource officers. And most of the departments in the Commonwealth that already had school resource officers had already enacted that MOU. In full disclosure, we had not. We had been pushing for that MOU for about 4 years, and we kept getting kind of sidetracked in political discussions about why it was necessary. And so prior to 2020, it was a recommendation that you have that MOU and a requirement that every municipality have at least one school resource officer assigned to the district. With police reform, it switched. Now it's a requirement that if you have an SRO, you must have that MOU, and it's no longer required that every municipality have at least one SRO. That's at the superintendent's discretion. So what is happening is that one of the committees within the committee is a committee on school resource officers, and they have just promulgated the updated model MOU for districts and municipalities. I haven't read the new language in it. My school resource officer commander is taking that for me, but there's not a lot of changes. We just brought on an SRO under the AG's model memorandum. The big difference for us was the interview was held at district headquarters instead of my headquarters. And in addition to my staff, the district staff was in the room for the interview. The second requirement of the new legislation or the new MOU is that as part of that process, even though we can make the decision on who the SRO is, before we can place the SRO officially, they have to have a joint meeting that includes faculty, staff, students, and parents to meet the SRO before they're formally placed in the school. So our new SRO will be having that meeting next week.
Excellent, thank you. Just, if we have any other questions here? A question about the term, let's see, the title of the commission is peace officers. Tell us more about how you understand that title on the commission.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The previous executive director of the Municipal Police Training Committee, Dan Zivkovich, who was a colleague and a friend of mine, anytime he spoke at a police graduation, he would offer prepared remarks, and they usually had the same theme. But one of the things he consistently said is, you are not law enforcement officers. Law enforcement is a very significant, but albeit small part of the job. You know, when you walk across that stage and you accept that badge, you are police officers or peace officers. And, you know, the fact of the matter is, a very small portion of what a police officer does, sheriff's deputy, state trooper does in their day-to-day activity comes down to actually enforcing the law. Most of what we do is about reestablishing order and maintaining order. And that comes down to keeping the peace. Now, sometimes keeping the peace can be mediating a dispute between two neighbors. Sometimes keeping the peace means taking somebody into custody against their will. A well-trained police officer needs to be able to do all of that and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Wonderful, thank you. Susan asked, we probably have time for just 2 more questions. Are there any ways these reforms are making your work easier or better?
Certainly. So the big one is certification and decertification. Right? And again, this is something police professionals have been asking for years. So if I had a candidate, and again, we're civil service, so this isn't going to happen to me, but if I had a candidate who wanted to apply to my department and they had worked in Las Vegas or Florida or Arizona, I can go to a federal database and I can find out if they ever got in trouble with a police department in one of those states and if they lost their license. But if they worked in Beckett here in Berkshire County, I can't look that up. The only way I can find out is if I've got a potentially bad cop is if they self-disclose to me where they previously worked, and that chief is willing to break the seal on a personnel record and tell me. So the certification and decertification is going to be huge for us, because I have done deep background checks and found bad cops in my process who were disciplined and let go by other agencies, but it's not on their resume and it's not on their application. We found it because we have good investigators. So that one's going to be huge. You know, some of the other stuff, the standard documentation is going to be great. There's a lot of good in here. Most of it is going to benefit us. There's some real concerning small things, but those are the ones that are going to cause the most headaches for the municipalities, unfortunately.
All right, so our last question, what discretion do towns like ours, so we're in Needham, have to go beyond or above the standards that are established?
As long as you don't violate the Constitution, any municipality can always, your policy, your internal policies and rules and regulations can always be more stringent. That doesn't change, but you can't violate the Constitution, and you can't violate the officer's constitutional rights either, right? Just because they took that job, they don't lose their due process rights and their constitutional rights. I'm looking at a misconduct allegation today, and you know, there's some things that we're looking at, say the officer do something wrong, but the complainant clearly attempted to violate the officer's constitutional rights. They're a misogynist racist, and they're going after my officer, right? So
Great, thank you so much. Chief Wynn, we can't thank you enough for all of your help tonight. It's been truly valuable, informative. If anyone wants to come off mute and clap, give him
I don't think I got
3
to all the
cheers.
questions,
Hip,
so I
hip, hooray.
apologize.
Oh, did you? Oh, I'm sorry. It's hard sometimes for me to see in the chat. Let's see.
There's more questions in that box than I answered. I just know that.
Oh, really? Let's see. You talked about state level reporting. What consolidated reporting would be available? I think you mentioned that. I'm trying to see if there's, oh, how does the community get police out of their cars
That is
and
not
out
with,
in the community
that is
on
not within the
bicycles or walking?
jurisdiction of the Post Commission. but I'm happy to give you some ideas about that. You can send me an email in the office.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you. Again, thank you so much, Chief Wynn. We really appreciate all of your work. We know you've been putting in so many hours, and our hats are off to you. And
Well,
we
thank
look
you.
forward to talking to you again soon. Take care.
Have a good evening,
Good night,
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.